All right, so this is part two in our discussion about structure, social stratification, say that 5 times fast, institutions, and kind of the bones that make up various societies. If you remember from last time, we talked about how Malinowski put forward the idea of functionalism, that every um, aspect of a culture has a function, and hopefully that doesn't seem like a novel idea to you, but at the time it really was. That these, air quotes again, primitive societies were making logical choices and doing everything effectively for a reason. So these institutions, these relationships, these subcultures, these cultures, a lot of times you'll hear that referred to as structure. The structure of a society is the organization of all of its parts. Parts can be institutions, they can be subcultures, they can be government entities, they can be a variety of different things. But this is all the structure of a culture. Typically, you use the term structure when you're talking about big cultures, macro cultures, right? You don't often talk about the structure of a subculture, though you could. So keep that in mind. So normally this is the bones of a structure, the patterns of behavior that really get people to do what they do. Some of the baseline aspects of structure, the kind of the classic components, are class division, especially often found amongst agricultural societies such as ours. Specialization, another key ingredient in agricultural industrialized societies like ours. And there are way more of these. You can talk about kinship, which we will. You can talk about marriage, which we will. You can talk about political economies, which we will, so on and so forth, right? I've just picked these two to talk about this in this lecture. And again, with these highly theoretical lectures, I want to stress that these are tools you can use, concepts you can apply to societies, to cultures, to subcultures that you encounter, not necessarily the case where there are right and wrong answers, right? Because social theory is kind of a toolbox to help you understand concepts, to help you break apart and compartmentalize and kind of build loose typologies of human behavior, right? So it's not like, if you argued that an aspect of structure was a political system, and nobody's going to be like, no, they're going to be like, oh, why do you think that, and what aspects of the structure do you see, right? So again, these lectures are not built of questions that are answered that are right and wrong. This is a set of tools that you can use, terms that you can apply to better understand the cultures you encounter. So many agricultural, especially industrialized agricultural societies, have what we call social class division. Often it's based on wealth, but not always. And sometimes a definition of wealth in one culture can vary wildly from the definition of wealth in another culture because people value different things, right? So status can also be included in determining your social class, parents, region of birth, and caste. Caste systems, such as those found in India, are genetically enforced class systems, such that if you're born Brahmin, you will be Brahmin for the rest of your life. There's no class mobility, and if you're Brahmin, you can only marry a Brahmin with a culturally sanctioned marriage and have a child that, of course, is Brahmin as well, which is the highest caste. Technically, medieval nobility in Europe was also a caste system, right? You were a peasant or you're a noble, and if you were born a peasant, you were little better than a slave, and you'd never move up to nobility. And if you're born a noble, you can't really go down to being a peasant. So, cultural capital is another concept I want to put out there before we examine some class divisions. Cultural capital are the items, titles, concepts, often financial, that help to maintain and separate people into classes. Examples include money, houses, cars, pigs, jewelry, which we'll talk about later as prestige goods. But it can be just favors, right? So it doesn't have to be material items. It can be cultural capital can be the people that you know, right? The example I always think of is a member of my family who works a job that's not particularly, I mean, it's not it pays, but not amazingly well. But in doing their job, they built up a lot of cultural capital, a lot of contacts, a lot of people that they knew who were in high places. And when that person got sick, they got sent to the absolute best doctors. And finally, their doctor had to call call them and say, "Who are you? Like, why are all these important doctors and lawyers asking about your well-being?" And they said, "Well, I just know all these people, right?" And so, of course, they ended up getting the best care because it was very important. Because the doctor that was taking care of them realized it was super important that they knew all these people, and these people were important, and so therefore this person must be important too. So cultural capital doesn't have to be physical objects. It's often relationships, non-monetary indications of your wealth, right? Things that people within your culture see through their Kulturbrille, culture glasses, as being indicators of wealth, right? So it could be who you know, it could be hobnobbing at the opera, it could be going to private parties at museums, so on and so forth. It could be titles, it could be even being the mayor is cultural capital, right? Things like that. And that varies from culture to culture. An example of that being that, honestly, one of the best known people in the state of Kentucky is Coach Calipari, who coaches our college basketball team. And that might not be the case in every state, right? I'm not sure that every other state, for instance, can you name the coach of the UMass basketball team, right? As a citizen of Massachusetts, you may or may not be able to, but pretty much everybody in Kentucky can name Coach Cal, and he carries a lot of cultural capital with him. Of course, he also makes a lot of money, but he has a lot of cultural capital because that position is a well-respected position in the state of Kentucky. So, I'm sorry, that green is a bit hard to see. So here we have class divisions compared. So on the left, we have the maybe not idealized, but probably concept of Western culture. So we can put in here the United States, that there's an upper, middle, and lower class, right? And if you think of the x-axis as number of people, so the wider the portion of the triangle, the more people are in that class. What's the y-axis, right? What controls whether you're lower, middle, or upper? And for us, it's a variety of things. It's the amount of money you have, the amount of cultural capital you have, the kind of cars you drive. You know, we have, if you look it up, which I encourage you to do, if you look it up, like how do we actually divide classes in the U.S., what you're going to find is that on the census, we do it by annual income, right? We've kind of arbitrarily decided that how much money you make per year puts you into different socioeconomic classes, right? Which is interesting because we call them socioeconomic classes, but that's all economic classes, right? If it's money. So we assume that you're in a equivalent social class if you make the equivalent amount of economic money. So basically our y-axis is wealth, right? The money you make, and the arbitrary way that we tend to divide that up in the United States is money per year. On the right, we have an ethnographic example of the class system which emerged in an area along the northwest coast among the indigenous Native Americans, or First Nations if you're in Canada. I like that term a lot better. Among the indigenous people of the northwest coast. So basically, mostly Washington to southern British Columbia is where this would be pertinent. And this is the ethnographic class system. So this is the class system that we encountered when anthropologists first went there, or that we heard about in the past that these people used to have. So the thing that, looking at this, so basically what we have here is the x-axis being number of people, and y-axis being, we'll talk about what the y-axis is. What you might notice is this one's kind of upside down compared to ours. That in fact most people are what they would call good people. Whole lineages strongly linked by tradition to village sites and natural resources, possessing wealth due to spirit power and ritual knowledge, inherited privileges and advice, and producing leaders. So what we find is that most people are what most societies would call elite, right? And that from those elite people, leaders emerge. You can see the arrows going back and forth. So if you are good people, if you have access to natural resources, we'll talk about how that works, you can become a leader through good action, essentially. And you can fall back down. You'll see the arrows going back down. Now, if your family doesn't like you and you are illegitimate, an orphan, If you're illegitimate, an orphan, and or a black sheep, then you would be plummeted down to worthless people. Worthless people are those who don't have access to that metaphorical resource. War captives can become slaves. Now, one of the things that students always point out when I do this exercise is, well, these are different because we don't have slaves. Keep in mind, when we're talking about that ethnographic system, and during times when the people of the Northwest Coast, or at least these specific people of the Northwest Coast, were using a system similar to this, we did in fact have slavery in the United States, and it's historically speaking the worst form of slavery ever seen in history that practiced in the United States. So while we could talk about the fact that at the time we're comparing here, they have slaves and we don't, that's not really fruitful conversation. So effectively, one person could be born amongst the good people, do good deeds, become a leader, then do bad deeds, end up in a war with somebody else, and then fall all the way back down to being a slave. They could then later be freed, become worthless people, and then they could then leave and claim a metaphorical right to a resource somewhere else. So I've referenced this metaphorical right to a resource a few times. The concept of property ownership amongst these people is somewhat different than our concept of property ownership among Western cultures. So the way it worked for them is you wouldn't own the land surrounding a river. Instead, you may own access to a salmon run along the river in October. Somebody else may own the salmon run along the river in September, right? And as long as you have metaphorical right to a resource like that, you have power. You're a good person, and you inherit this from your mother or your father, because you can deny that resource to somebody. So, you know what? You made me mad. No salmon for you in October because I own it. Now, you probably wouldn't do that often, but that's the difference between, in this system, good people and worthless people. And the other thing I want to point out is there are more good people in this system than there are worthless or slaves. So the majority of people are good landowning people. Now, the reason I'm telling you so much about this isn't to have you memorize a ton of facts about the Northwest Coast class system during a random time. It's just because it serves as a really good example to show you that class systems can be very different from our own. Right? Our society works really hard to make you think that this is a natural and the only way of doing things. Right? And so it works so hard at that and does a great job. It makes you think, you know what, they're going to be poor people, they're going to be middle class people, and they're going to be some rich people, and that's just how it is. Right? And it really reinforces that to the point where the church reinforces that. Our government certainly reinforces that. Economic models reinforce that, right? We've told ourselves that over and over again. We like to tell stories of the very poorest people working their way all the way up to being the upper class in an effort to show you that that can be done, and it can. But so we have this mythos behind our class system that maintains it. I'm not advocating for the Northwest Coast system we're pretty sure it falls apart at certain times due to various system failures. But more than anything, I'm showing you that there can be other class systems, right? Because our culture works so hard to naturalize our class system that sometimes you can kind of lose track of that. So another thing that is often deeply rooted in the structure of a society is division of labor based on gender. And this is something we're working to change in our society, but you can still see the effects on it, right? On average, I think women still make 84 to 86% of what men do on average. So we are still dividing our specializations, the jobs we choose to do, in part based on gender, and then the pay that they get is still based on gender. This is found in gather-hunter societies. In most gather-hunter societies, women tend to gather and men tend to hunt, though that is not always the case. There are definitely exceptions to every rule when it comes to human behavior. One of my favorite exceptions to this is an archaeologist colleague of mine. Every time she gives a presentation on the Clovis culture, which is the 13,000-year-old occasionally mammoth hunting individuals that both she and I study, she has a silhouette that she uses of a mammoth hunter, and it is very clearly purely female, and it really annoys some of the archaeologists in the crowd, but I love it. So you can find that in societies, past, present, industrialized societies, and gathering hunting societies, and everything in between, that there is structurally a division of labor based on gender. And I'm not just necessarily talking only about male and female. Of course, I'm also talking about non-binary individuals who also may find their labor structured, restricted, or something like that because they're not male or female gendered. So it's not just exclusively a problem of gender stratification in which men tend to make more or tend to have better paying or tend to have more opportunities than just women. People who are non-binary also can suffer ill effects based on societal structure, division of labor. So we've touched on this, but I want to talk about it specifically again, is the concept of specialization. When someone else grows or produces enough food so that you don't have to work to produce your own food, you can do something else. And we, of course, live in a industrialized agricultural society in which we are highly, highly specialized, right? Because we have farmers and people raising cattle and people working in grocery stores that make sure that our food gets to us, and we're free to do something else, something that's very highly specialized. I mean, if you look at my job, it's very highly specialized. I specifically teach on a single subject and I research on that subject. And for that, they pay me money, and then I use that money to buy food and whatever else I want, right? At the most basic and early level, if one person farms, somebody else can do something else. They might make ceramics. They get better at making ceramics, so the quality of your food goes up, the quality of the ceramic vessels you have go up, and this kind of snowballs in many times until you get to the society we have today where we are hyper specialized, right? You are going to college to learn specifically the skills needed for your specialized field. And this really can't happen and doesn't happen often in societies in which one person has to do labor to get food for themselves, right? And in doing that labor, they only make enough food for themselves and maybe a couple members of their family. To have specialization occur, you have to have people making enough food so that other people are free to do something else, right? Then they can become soldiers, police officers, religious leaders, teachers, politicians, whatever, right? The advantages or consequence of specialization is the specialist usually becomes better at making the thing, item, or performing the service. You might have some people who just specialize in inventing new stuff or coming up with new methods, and so you get access to new things, to new methods, to new theories, so on and so forth. So you get a higher quality product because somebody else is making food for you. Specialization, of course, is vital to the development of a state-level political system, which we'll talk about soon, and increase social complexity in general. At some point, somebody has to start specializing in things so that your society can have more moving parts and, in many times, more complicated relationships between those moving parts, i.e., becomes more complex. Even though gatherer-hunters require about one person's effort to make about one person's worth of food, we do see some specialization among them. And often the earliest and often most found among hunter-gatherer specialization is shaman, religious leader, that you'll find somebody who's a part-time shaman. So they might gather and hunt sometimes, and they might be paid with food for their special religious expertise at other times, acting as a shaman. We have, I asked the question, what kind of specializations do we have in Western culture? And we have tons, right? We probably have, the Westernized, industrialized culture has more specializations probably than anybody else, right? Especially if you include most of the countries that I include in the Westernized macro culture, because we have lots of innovation, we have lots of training, lots of specialized training, right? And I think of this as a snowball going downhill that becomes an avalanche. Once you get specializations, you will come up with more specializations, and people in those specializations will find new ways to specialize, new ways to make a living, until you have this hyper-specialized society that we live in now. And I think that will continue to increase, that people will become increasingly specialized in the way they make money so that they can get food. All right, that's all I've got for this lecture. Check out the next one.